what happened to the recording. Oh, got it. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. And then the other thing is that, and then the second thing to really bear in mind in terms of sort of the dates here and status is that it sort of ignores the fact that Africans were being enslaved and being brought to the Americas for centuries prior to 1619, right? So what makes the 1619 date so important? When you have enslaved people being moved into Brazil, what was Hispaniola, now of course Haiti and Dominican Republic, etc. So again, that's really, really problematic.
Stephen, any response or reflections?
Yeah, I mean, I again, this is going to be a terrible debate. I agree with everything he said, and would just reiterate a couple of points that made me, it was such a lost opportunity, because here you have, and it does kind of drive me nuts sometimes about historians that how we're treated, but people act like these are new questions that have never been addressed, and as Jeffrey said, these are things that have all been debated and among people who spend their lives studying this stuff, and then some journalists roll out of bed one day and think they've invented this. The part of it that I would and I would say that they just blew the as he said, the context question, which is I think what Jeffrey was also saying, which is slavery needs to be seen in American history and in world history in its proper context, and having these people who maybe don't know much about the work that historians have done, it blew this chance to put American slavery in its national and global context. Now, there is some defensible part of the 1619 project, which is that I do think it's valuable to gain these perspectives and have these debates and say, here's a collection of people who are thinking about these issues, and we're collecting these essays. The problem comes from when those contributions are not put in their proper context. And then when you say, and then how the New York Times handled the criticism was also strange, which was to wipe its own history and then never acknowledge that the edits that they made and the presentations that they did beforehand, and it was downright Orwellian how the New York Times handled the legitimate criticism of the project. But it sounds like maybe I'm being nicer about the project than Jeffrey is.
I'm not being unnice about it. What I appreciate is debating the past, as I've said. What I also appreciate is people putting material out there, which is the basis for a debate. But I think it's quite an indictment of the American historical profession that there is this huge disconnect between all the knowledge that we have and all of the books and articles that we publish, and the fact that we have high school students coming in as freshmen in the university and they don't know much. That is an indictment. One of the reasons why I'm here, and I accepted Stephen Jackson's invitation, and believe you me, I have a lot of other things going on in my life, is because I have felt over the last decade that it's really important to sort of reach out to non-academics, to ordinary men, women, and children in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Europe, to talk about the material, to talk about history, because this is the stuff that we know, and to actually make it accessible. And that, I think, is a really important part of the 1619 project. I don't like the way they went about it. I've always been critical of the New York Times, and it's got nothing to do with the fact that they refused to publish any of my op-ed pieces. I can
Okay.
It's because I think that the stereotypes that they have of Black Americans are awful. Black Americans are either criminals or celebrities, but ordinary Black Americans are rarely represented in the pages of the New York Times. It's not exactly a paragon, right, of sort of its own objective writing. So, you know, I'm not sort of surprised, but, you know, the fact is that there is an indictment of professional historians. We live good lives. I don't know about you, Stephen, but, you know, my life was inconvenienced by COVID, but I did not lose people. I did not lose my job. I did not lose my home, right? Because I'm a tenured professor, right? And, you know, I have a real problem with this. I think that, you know, as as an entitled member of society, you know, there is much more that we could do, and we don't, and it's a real problem.
Well, we have about 15 more minutes or so, maybe 17 if I stretch it, to get through the next two segments. My final comment on this section, which is, I'm actually awestruck by both of your comments, but they say journalism is the first rough draft of history. So you've really kind of given me a lot of food for thought to critical thinking as I consume various media sources. So without further ado, you made me both think a lot. So now it's time to move to segment 3, Confederate symbols and Southern heritage. What role should they play in 2021? We know about the alt-right marches in Charlottesville. There's in the Delaware district, Virginia and Maryland, there's, you know, a lot of Confederate, and in the Carolinas and the other Southern states, a lot of Confederate symbols. On January 6th, we saw a Confederate flag that was marched into the Capitol that hadn't been there, you know, ever during the actual Civil War. So my question, Jeffrey, is what did the Confederacy stand for, and how is it connected to Southern heritage today?
Well, it's a symbol, and like most symbols, it's impossible to generalize, to come up with a sort of a definition. But I think it's really important for audience members to recognize what the Confederacy was. The Confederacy was an attempt at the creation of an independent slaveholding republic based upon the US Constitution. All right, that's what the Confederacy was. The Confederate States of America. It was an attempt at secession. It was an attempt at nation building. And it was a slaveholding republic because all of the political leaders were major slave owners, right? And slavery was protected and enshrined. So in terms of what the Confederacy was historically, that's the answer. In terms of Southern heritage, again, very, very complicated, right? And, you know, hopefully we can get into some of those complications later on. But I do think that one of the central, I disagree with those people who say that the Confederate flag means only one thing, race hate. I don't like Black people. I think that's really problematic. I think there are too many, flag waving Confederates who do think that, all right, and have all sorts of strange explanations, reasons for that. But I think that there's more than that. And I think in terms of and I'm looking forward to getting to a couple of those questions I say later on, but looking at this creation of the flag and what it represents nowadays, one of the continuums, I think, is that a lot of the supporters of the Confederacy in the 1860s and in the early 21st century see that flag as a symbol of anti-statism, of republicanism with a small r, which is we do not want to be controlled by a centralized power, by a state, right? And I think that is very, very important to the symbolism of the Confederacy. It is anti-Lincoln, it is anti-Biden because of the political power that sort of Washington, D.C. represents. And I probably can see this clearer than most Americans because I come from Europe and I've been in the United States for nearly 4 decades. and studied. And I see that. I'm really struck by that tremendous sort of anti-statism, that republicanism, the republic, right? Which is against that centralized power. And I think that type of thinking really sort of helps us understand, okay, the sort of longevity of the symbol. But I'm going to talk about, I hope, get an opportunity to talk about the racism of the Confederate flag as well. But that political part is really important.
Well, I definitely want to hear what your thoughts are on that. So we're going to come right back to you, but I want to give Stephen a chance to reflect. What did the Confederacy stand for in your view?
Racism, the attempt, as Jeffrey said, this is the attempt to create to fix the problem of the United States. And the Southerners saw that there's this problem with the United States. The U.S. Constitution was not created on the basis of organizing a government around racism and the protection of slavery. And so they needed to fix this problem. And they were explicit that what they wanted to do was create a government explicitly on the basis of racism and the protection of slavery. And as he said, for many people over the decades, that the symbol of the rebel battle flag at various times has kind of stood for small r republicanism and anti-statism, or just generally rebellion. And I would just say this anecdotally, I've never scratched the lottery ticket of somebody waving a Confederate flag and not found a racist. So
Powerful statement.
What's that?
I said that's a powerful statement.
Well, when you get to these arguments where people want to make these cases that this is about heritage, not hate, well, start asking them about what heritage it is that they're trying to preserve, and what you find is, oh, they're trying to preserve hate. I mean, every now and then I'd be on a panel with, years ago, let's say 20 years ago, I might be on a panel with a libertarian with a Confederate flag on his lapel or something, and maybe that guy is making some statement about small r republicanism, but I think you're right in the sense of an expression of an emotion. It can often express an emotion of rebellion. You can't tell me what to do. I'm doing this in order to be offensive. But once you get just a little bit past that, you're usually talking to someone who's an actual racist. And as far as the monuments go, I've always found it strange that they exist in the first place. And again, historians have these tools. I find it just perplexing that people will say, we don't know which monuments to tear down. You know, you're going to tear down Abraham Lincoln, but you're going to leave up Stonewall Jackson. And like, no, I propose this. If you're trying to figure out whether you should tear down a Confederate monument, go back and see when it was built, who built it, read the speeches, and see if it was put up in order to perpetuate racism and celebrate the lost cause thesis. And if it is, then tear it down. But if it's a monument to the ideas that are opposed to the rebellion, then leave it up. I just don't understand why it has to be so hard. And the other thing that has bothered me many years as a historian is just trying to disentangle the racism. There's one of my kids walking by who had one in the pool. Disentangle all of the racism out of the accounts of American history. You know, the people who pushed the lost cause thesis have been remarkably effective at ruining how American history was understood. In that last historians poll, I noticed that Grant finally took a jump up in the rankings, but that should tell you just how effective the lost causers were at painting Grant as nothing more than a drunken butcher, and his administration as nothing more than a seedbed of corruption. and how many people think of American history? Oh, in the 19th century, the 19th century politicians were nothing but big government. Well, what big government project was it that they were pushing? Reconstruction. How much of our view of Reconstruction is simply racists trying to make this argument in a slightly more respectable way? And you just find these elements of racism in how people have interpreted American history for the past 150 years. And I almost feel like we have to go back to the drawing board with all of this stuff, because the lost cause people have been so effective at spinning American history to their own advantage. So I guess I find it deeply offensive, and I guess I'm willing to go along with Jeffrey, and because I'm not from another country, and you're right. Maybe if I was from another country, I would notice the small r republicanism there a little bit more. But and maybe this is me relying a little too much on my own anecdotal experiences. But every time somebody's yelling at me at a history conference for saying stuff like this, 3 sentences into the conversation, you find out that they're racist.
Wow.
So, you know, I don't know where to start, but it's great because I'm going to disagree with you here, Stephen. I think the first thing we need to recognize, and out of respect to the Republican supporters with a big R and the panel here, it's important to recognize that the post-Civil War federal government was aggrandizing. It was expansionist, and it was largely Republican. It wasn't just railroads. It was also Union troops. It was also funding the largest industrial project in the 19th century United States was in Utah in the 1870s and 1880s. If you look at Richard White's excellent work right on the West, points this out. So that's the first point to recognize. This is an expansionist government taking advantage of the fact that it defeated the Confederacy. That's the first point. The second point I would make is that the lost cause has been successful, but I would argue, in contrast to you, Stephen, that actually it's been seriously challenged. In the 1890s, populism, the Farmers Alliance, okay, which brought black farmers and white farmers together in the South and in the West, was a tremendous challenge to the Southern democratic machine. In the 1920s, the reason why you saw so many of these statues created, rising up wasn't because of racism. The way you use this as this sort of machina explana for everything is really problematic, because that makes it ahistorical. Those monuments are being put up precisely because the South politically felt that it was under tremendous challenge. The 1930s too as well. Again, trying to sort of understand Southern heritage today, it's a very, very different scenario. Sure, you can scratch, and sure, you can find a bigot and a racist and a person's committed to white supremacy. Sure, you can. But in terms of structures and in terms of contingency in history, in terms of counter-hegemonic forces, things which push against power, you're flattening it. And I think it's much more complicated than that. In fact, I do not see the history of the South as one long exercise in white supremacy. I see it as an attempt, and I see its success here, but its failure there. And it's that contestation that I'm really interested in, precisely because the role that Black people, Black Southerners up until the Great Migration, and then afterwards played in challenging that. I'll just give you one small example. Most people have heard of the Ku Klux Klan. A few less people are aware of the fact that this was created by an ex-Confederate general in Tennessee in 1866. I think there's an audience member from Memphis, okay? But that within 10 years, it had been defeated. largely and gone underground because of federal troops, right, led by Grant. What is not told is that 189,000 Black men fought in 180 regiments during the American Civil War. Between 30 to 40,000 of them died. That left 150,000 Black veterans who went back from Virginia, from the Mississippi Valley to their communities. The Union sold them arms. These Black troops defended their communities. So what we hear of is white terror, white supremacy. What we do not hear about is Black self-defense. There are communities in the South where white paramilitary troops, the Klan, would not dare go because they would get shot to death. They wouldn't go to certain places because they knew that they were coming up against men with guns who had been trained to fight and to shoot. And so I think that contestation is really, really important, right? Because otherwise, we're left with these sort of sweeping generalizations, all right, which I think ignore the sort of the struggle, the contestation, which really is what history represents.
So in the interest of time, and I want to open it up to the audience, I want to get to our final and fourth segment, which is hopefully going to end us on a high note. This has kind of been a heavy conversation. Is what lessons from U.S. history can you provide when citizens were able to build bridges among diverse groups, diverse in race, ethnicity, and thought, and how they made meaningful progress that benefited the country? So Professor Tootle, I'm going to start with you. The United States, at least to me, seems to be more divided than any time in my lifetime, both politically along racial and ethnic lines. So is there a time in US history that is like what was taking place now, or has the past 10 or 15 years truly been unique on all levels?
Well, certainly, I think, Jeffrey used the word modernity earlier. Modernity has changed how we perceive these differences, and but in terms of privately held beliefs and putting those beliefs into actions in violent ways, there are parallels that you can find throughout all of American history, and certainly nothing comes close to the Civil War in terms of people actually killing one another on a mass scale. But I think in terms of the most constructive advice I can give anyone who wants to actually make progress is to not use labels when you talk to someone, because everybody wants to sort of a shortcut to doing the difficult work, and having a label will often provide that shortcut. But if you were to do that with me, you might say, here is a white, conservative, Christian, heterosexual male, and then stop listening to everything else that I say, because you have some sort of association with each of those labels that changes how you would view me. But if you simply approach people and take them as they are and listen to the words that they're actually using, you can often have a far more productive conversation that will actually build bridges between people. I think the example of civil rights progress in the law is often a lagging indicator of society. Sometimes it's a leading indicator, but if you think about how you actually change a culture, you change a culture by figuring out that sort of 80 or 90% that you have in common with someone else, and then realize that maybe our differences are actually pretty slight, And you have to do that with people who disagree with you, not people who agree with you. So you have to also change how you value feedback. In other words, if what you value is memes and likes and shares, then you're going to always be preaching to the choir. You will always be talking to people who agree with you and doing nothing more than to make that message smaller, shorter, and more crude. But I mean, why don't people read history books? Because they're long. Because learning is hard. And wouldn't it be easier if this was just a meme that we could share in order to signal our virtues to one another? I would say do the long, hard work of being a good person to everyone you encounter in life. And that will lead to a much more decent society. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. Jeffrey, any reflections on that?
On the question or on what, Stephen?
On the question.
Okay, so, well, yes, you know this, Stephen, you give a historian a public platform. Now, you know you're going to get reflections.
Yes.
But I just want to, before I answer the question, I just want to sort of say something very briefly about sort of the symbols of Confederate statues, etc.
Sure.
Confederate statues are not really my the subject that I look at, but I tend to look at sort of attempts to memorialize slavery and its abolition. Okay, and I would say this, that I understand people destroying statues, especially the youth. We're all there once. Hey, I get it. I mean, I understand that politically, I have no problem with it. What I would say though is that my alternative would be either to put up an explanatory panel on each of these statues saying these were not built in 1865, but they actually were built in 1922. And this is why they were built, as a reflection of white supremacy, to maintain white supremacy. I think I would either do that, or what is even better, put them in a museum, because people visit museums. I know that in Lincoln Park, for example, there's a wonderful picture, there's a wonderful statue of Lincoln with sort of a kneeling slave. And there's obviously debate over the symbolism of that. But the important thing is that it was actually funded by an ex-slave woman from Missouri. She helped start that project when that statue went up. So it's a Black inspired statue. The sad thing is that you go to Lincoln Park, where I used to run and a lot, and the only people who are paying attention to that statue are the dog walkers, and the dog is having a pee against the basis, right, of the statue. No one's looking at it, right? So that is the problem with those types of things. I think museums are the place for them. I don't think you should destroy the past. I think America needs to be constantly reminded of its past in order to understand its present and its future. You can't destroy this. This is really, really problematic. Even the former Soviet Union has not destroyed. They understood this. They have not destroyed a lot of statues of Lenin, a lot of statues of Stalin. If you go to Vietnam as well, and China, and I've spoken to these places, they still have a lot of those, and they're not up there to celebrate those leaders. We leave that to North Korea. They're up there as reminders of the past. And I think that's very, very important. But in terms of the sort of lessons, these types of questions are really problematic. I would just say this. So anyone who asked the question, does the United States seem more divided now than ever before, I think needs to do an awful lot of reading about the past. Okay. Precisely because I can't think of a time when the United States, as a person who's been studying US history for nearly 40 years, when the United States has not been fractured, whether it's the revolutionary period, whether it's the abolitionist movement, when people died to fight to get rid of Southern slavery, whether it's sort of populism in the 1890s, whether it's the 1960s, etc. You know, this is just, I think what we have now is we are so inundated with spectacle that it seems like we're much more fractious than we were in the past. But I think that's got a lot to do with the fact that people are not doing enough reading about the fractious nature of the past, precisely because, you know, e pluribus unum, okay, is just, you know, thrown into your head, right, all the time. In terms of the top three, you said lessons about the past. I would just say this. I think that the best definition of history that I've ever read came from a Dutch historian who wrote a history of Napoleon Bonaparte. And each chapter was a different Napoleon Bonaparte. And he said, history is an argument without end. So that's the first thing. It's an argument without end. Anyone who says this is how history happened, that's when you say, okay, I can't really talk to this person because you're not interested in the past. You don't care about history. You just care about ideology. And whether you're a lefty or you're a righty, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a Republican, if you're open to history as an argument, then I think there's a future for you. If you just say, well, the left is right or the right is right, then that's a problem. The second thing is I would say that, as the Greeks used to say, panta rei, everything changes. American history is all about change, right? It has transformed itself remarkably, whether you look at it from a 4th century long perspective or you look at the history of the nation, 250 something years. Change is absolutely central. And I think that, you know, oftentimes the response to that change has either been an embrace because people feel like they haven't been part of that change, or a fear because they think they've got something to lose. And certainly I think a lot of the sort of the racism, the latest manifestation of white supremacy that we're experiencing, thanks to the power from the top for 4 years, really driving this. Certainly not the starter of it, but certainly took full advantage of utilizing as a way to propel himself to the top in the most invidious fashion. And don't take my word for it. Look at the moderate Republican Party, all of whom are probably here because the other folks wouldn't be here. They're the sensible people in the Republican Party. The third point I would say is that I think a lot of the change that's come about in the United States to make it a more just Republican society has come from these groups who have suffered from persecution, have been ignored, and have strived to change the nation, right? And I think that's very positive, and that's not to be looked down upon. I think it's to be embraced. When a nation recognizes the symbolism of racist hatred that we witnessed last year, this is very important. I don't know what historians, or maybe Stephen's got something to say about this. I don't know what historians will make of 2020, but I do think this is a very interesting moment. I'm seeing all sorts of things I've not seen before in all sorts of ways. What it adds up to, who knows? But I do think that's sort of very important. And it's not so much the event, it's the response to the event, which really strikes me as very interesting. And I'll conclude by saying this, if Joe Biden has an incredible opportunity here to lead, not in the ways that most people in this panel think, most people who are listening think, but in terms of the only event that I can think of that captured international attention was the protests against the George Floyd's murder last summer. You had these protests in New Zealand, in Australia, in West African nations with Black political leaders, right? Saying, you know, we are being persecuted based upon ethnicity, right? It wasn't race, it was ethnicity. I thought to myself, wow, Biden should be carrying forth with that. Instead, it's sort of limited this to this sort of this domestic sort of program. I think this is a very important sort of opportunity for American leadership, but I'm not sure if he'll take it.
So we've come to the time where I really want to get some audience participation. So first, I'm going to go to John Brackney, who's one of the co-founders. John, why don't you jump in, and if you have a comment or reflection or question for our esteemed panelists.
Thank you, Stephen. This is directed to Professor Kerr-Ritchie. John Hodge is an educator as well, my co-founder, and we founded this a month or two before George Floyd. And we think we've got really important work to do by diverse groups having these types of conversations. Professor Tootle's a friend. We met at the American Enterprise Institute. And he says it's fine to have opinions, John, but if you really want to make a change in society, do your work and try to understand what has happened. So he made me read a book called American Slavery, American Freedom by Edmund Morgan. And I read that book, and I'm actually more confused about our history now because I'm a lifelong lover of America. I'm the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and yes, a lifelong Republican.
You've gone silent. I can't hear you.
I think we lost him for a minute.
Yeah. John, are you still there? We lost your audio.
It's a connection issue.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Where'd you lose me? What line?
Right when you were about to make the big point.
We love America.
You love America, and then you.
Thank you. And if someone wants to attack America or say we're just an evil country, period, because of slavery, I'm not willing to particularly listen to that. And so can you give a reaction? Are we a good and decent country with a lot of problems, or are we a lousy country with some virtue? Can you give it some sense of how we should feel about our country?
I can't. I just can't. For me, it's a provocative question, John. I don't think it really helps. I mean, I trust that I've been speaking for the last hour precisely against those types of knee-jerk. I'm not interested. I don't have those. I don't earn a living having those types of conversations. I walk away from them, or sometimes at a conference I say, "You're an idiot," and I move on. You know, because I have no time for that sort of thing. I think it's just nonsense. But I will challenge you on this. I'm always, Dr. Samuel Johnson, the great English lexicographer in the late 18th century, once said, "Patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel." And I think we have to be very careful when we evoke patriotism or nationalism as a response to criticism of one's nation. To suggest for a moment that Martin Luther King hated the United States is basically, I think, a qualification for putting you in an insane asylum, right? You would agree with that, right, John? So I think that, I think there is a love of patria, which is thoughtful, which recognizes how great a country can be, right? I mean, that's the way I think, and I say that about the United States. I say it about the UK, etc. But otherwise, I'm not really interested in sort of name calling and is this good, bad feelings. I've got no real contribution there. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Helpful, but it seems like that's all society does now. So thank you for the plea not to be doing that, but it seems like that's all society does. Professor Tootle, do you have a quick response, and then back to you, Stephen?
I've always gotten around this question by simply saying that, there are a handful of traits in human history that I'm willing to say are good, and most of those are codified in the Declaration of one paragraph in the Declaration of Independence. And if I define my patriotism as a commitment to those ideals, then I don't have a problem with patriotism. Jeffrey's point is well taken, that usually people are trying to drag you into a political conversation that is counterproductive. The only reason I think it's valuable to engage in those conversations is because I think it's important to meet the public where they are. And if they're asking me that question, it's because they want to know something. And I, I do a lot of public events and public speaking, and I of course have my lines that I will draw, but I try really hard to, when I'm dealing with the public, meet them where they are and get them to sort of take the next step and consider my efforts successful if I can just get them to take whatever that next step is.
And I would say this, John, in answer to your question, I want you to understand this very carefully. British people, and I don't speak for them because I don't live in the UK, but I can tell you, British people love American society and they love American culture. But British people go up and down in terms of the American state. That's the distinction that they make. So they, in the 1990s, they were more likely to like American culture and the two-term president, right, than they were in the 1980s, and they were in 2016, 2020. Now, let me be clear here. This is not a critique of Republican presidents, right? It's because I couldn't guess at what their response was to Bush 1 and Bush 2, right? But that's the distinction I would sort of make. It's the state, and it's an empire. It's a power, which a lot of Americans are unaware of. That's what a lot of non-Americans feel in their lives. It's not just the power of culture, it's the power of the American state. All right. And that's what, and so it's possible to really admire and respect and to even love the United States. But when the US government makes certain decisions which disproportionately impact people, yeah. So it doesn't matter. Palestine is a classic example. The claim of it being an honest broker. That is recognized to be really problematic, given America's support for the state of Israel, for obvious political, historical reasons, and the reduced support for the Palestinian right to self-determination, etc. Let's see what happens in Haiti. What role of the state? I mean, the US supported a dictator. Moise should not have been assassinated, but the guy declared, the National Assembly hasn't met for 2 years because Moise, the president, said you can't, right? These are the types of things which don't exactly endear the United States to people around the world. They don't hate the United States, right? But they have a problem with the power of the US when it's making decisions like that. So I would make that distinction. Is that good?
Yep, that sounds good. John Hodge, do you have any questions or comments for our panelists?
I want to thank both panelists and participants for being here today. John Brackney and I, and the whole leadership team have been talking about the difference between inciting and informing. And I think what happened today was more on the informing side, which is very pleasing to me. And I just want to speak for the team that we appreciate your time.
Thanks, John, for your comment. Stephanie Haskell was curious. She posted a little bit earlier. She said if either professor would adjust what history is taught today, given CRT as a framework for examining laws in school, or yet in school, she wasn't taught a complete history. Any reactions to that? Stephen, why don't we go with you first?
Okay, I would just reiterate what I said earlier, which is that that you should learn the box before you think outside the box. You know, you have to sort of learn the basic contours of American history in order to be able to put new information into its proper context. You know, information in context is useful. Information out of context is propaganda, or you know, what I'm trying to remember how the old saying, you know, text without context is a pretext for your own prejudices, or another way of putting it is, you know that you've created God in your own image if he hates all the same people you do. So taking those kind of twin ideas, the reason we want to teach Americans history, and I'll say, you know, there's another thing that you remind me of. I am nervous about one thing, or a couple of things, I should say, that in American political culture right now, and that is probably I don't see the commitment to political pluralism among political and educational elites that is necessary to withstand this the kind of challenges that modernity is throwing at it. And I do find it concerning, but as Jeffrey said, we're gonna have to wait for some future historian to write this story. But just as a historian, that my spidey sense is just tingling a little bit about that one issue.
And I would say, Stefan, well, first of all, thanks, John Hodge, for your response. It is important to inform rather than incite. However, you should come and hear me speak sometimes on Howard's campus, on other places, because I can incite as well in a cause that I think is important, right? But at the moment, we're being informative, and that's cool. In terms of, was it Tiffany's question, Stefan?
Stephanie.
Excuse me, Stephanie's question. Yeah, I think we touched upon it earlier. Maybe she came on later or something. But all I would say is this: I would treat CRT the way I treat anything that's taught in a sort of school environment, which is you've got to take into account the level of the student's sort of acumen and ability. B, as I say to undergraduates all the time at Howard University when I'm teaching them, and they'll say, "Professor, I was never taught this." My response will be, "Why do you think you should only be educated according to schools? Why don't you read independently? Why don't you think for yourself?" This is very, very important. I think one of the biggest failures of most educational systems globally is the idea that education is institutionalized. It doesn't have to be. I'm always saying to my kids, look, guys, you know, I'm a professor of history. Okay. We have thousands of books in the house. Okay. Most of them you can't read at the moment, you're too young. But, you know, hopefully you'll be interested later on. But you know what? What you get taught at school is what you get taught at school. There are agendas. There are school districts. There are Democratic, Republican administrations, governors, etc. All, yeah. But the thing is, you have no control over those things. You might have a vote one day, but you know. But what you do have control over is reading, is asking questions, right? Is being engaged. I think that's absolutely critical. You know,
absolutely.
You don't have to teach civics. I've always thought it's ironic, teaching civics in class. I'm sure Stephen would disagree, and maybe some other people. I think it's a complete waste of time. I think it is. I mean, I think, you know, what you do is you get people to engage with other people. You talk to them, have differences. You read, you learn. Some intellectual battles you win, some you lose, some bruise you, others inspire you. That's life. There's no shortcut here, right?
Mm-hmm. So, Brian, you have your hand up. Why don't you come in and let us know your thoughts and ask a question to the panelists.
Hey, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, professors, for your wonderful discussion today. It might be provocative, but you know, that's life. First, I was hoping that you would be willing to share your reading lists with Stephen after this Zoom session, so that maybe some number of us can read some of the things that you think we should be reading, so that we can kind of get a sense of what box it is that we are in, and therefore, you know, how to move forward. Because I do agree with much of what's been said today. I would add that maybe one of the prerequisites is beyond just understanding history and participating in events like this, is that we need to have the same definition of success on what it means to engage with other people on social media. Because I feel like the basic, we can agree on the general contours of the problem, but unless we all agree that that we agree on the same way of how we get together, which is to work with other people civilly, it makes it harder. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Thanks again.
So any reactions? Jeffrey, why don't we start with you first?
Thanks, Brian. I'm not sure if I can provide a reading list. It would take me forever. And, you know, as I've made it very clear, I'm sort of, the summer is a time when I can write books. So I'm afraid that all I can suggest to you is to sort of do some digging. But I would say, I would disagree with you, Brian, in terms of sort of agreement. I don't think much comes from agreement. I think disagreement without being disagreeable, right, is the key. And it never ceases to amaze me. I mean, I think the definition of someone who doesn't understand politics is someone the definition of someone who could never earn a living as a politician is someone who's being disagreeable when they're disagreeing. Because as I say to people all the time, why are you personalizing this so much? You know, most of the people that are up there that you see on your TV or what have you, making political statements, which are completely opposite, right? Whether it be a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, they'll say things on the Hill, they'll say things on NewsHour, they'll say things on the sort of Sunday morning shows. But guess what? Where do you think they go to dinner? Whose families do you think they associate with? I mean, right? It seems to me it's the height of ignorance to think that these people carry the sort of divisive, disagreeable sort of attitudes, right? And political goals. They don't. There are individuals who do, I dare say, but it's much more, I don't know, it's sort of, it's a bubble, and people couldn't survive if they really, really, really felt that way. There's a lot of spectacle, there's a lot of posturing, right? And see that for what it is. So that's just an invitation to say that you can disagree fundamentally and passionately. God, how boring life would be if we didn't. God, if we all agreed. But don't be an idiot. Right? When you're doing it, I mean, there's no reason, and you're not going to persuade the other person, right? So, just disagree, right? Think about sort of, disagreeing without being disagreeable.
Stephen, any quick reaction?
Oh, just I'd shared in a previous episode a kind of reading list on, and I would still, I guess, probably stand by that. And just in response to what Jeffrey said, I would agree and say, often getting people to agree to the terms of the debate is the most important thing. And then understanding that you're probably never going to persuade the person you're disagreeing with, but there are people who are listening, and they're usually the ones who are open, and cultivate the habit of an open mind to the extent, our prejudices and our confirmation biases, they're all in our brains somewhere. And so with your conscious brain, try to fight those things insofar as you can.
I think that's really complicated though, Stephen, because you said earlier, that I wish that people would listen to me and not see me as a white, what did you say, some white,
whatever labels,
straight, right? And I'd listen to it, I think to myself, my goodness, I didn't realize that until you said it. Because actually, guess what? There are those of us who actually think that the most important thing is not what you look like, it's actually what you have to say.
Right.
Because we're having a discussion. This is right. This is about ideas. And I don't know, I'm a little less sort of cynical than you on this, Stephen. I don't think that everyone does. I think a lot of people, and I'll give you an example. Even the most perspicacious among you have recognized that I'm not a Black American, but I teach at a Black American institution.
Mhm.
I can count, and I've taught I've taught thousands of students. I can count on one hand the amount of students who've dismissed me because of my identity. What they're interested in is what I have to say, right? They're not judging me. They'll judge what I have to say, but so I think at the height of sort of, understand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that identity is irrelevant, not at all. It is absolutely vital and fundamental. But what I am saying is it's not the only prism through which people are heard. A lot of it's got to do with what you have to say. Right.
I hope you both can stay on just a few more minutes. Herbert, you've had your hand up. Do you want to jump in real quick with your comment or statement?
Yes, absolutely. First, it's been a blast listening to this dialogue. I'm an HBCU grad.
Hi, Herbert.
Hey, how you doing?
How you doing?
And, it's been fascinating listening to people actually talk about, these historical topics in their, not just in the context, but in terms of how they relate to, social and political constructs. So I had a question to pose to both of the professors here. And it's essentially, how hard has it been as historians to explain the relationship between the history of this country and its effect on social and cultural policy? And I ask that because we as African Americans have, made a lifetime of trying to explain those types of relationships to people that don't necessarily get it right offhand.
Mhm. Excellent. Stephen, why don't we go with you first? And I'm going to give Jeffrey a minute to think.
My first response is that history is often, when it enters the political debate, people immediately are just kind of taking bits and pieces out to use as weapons against one another. And that's usually how history enters the political debate, is as kind of ammunition to fire at one another, which then results in one of the themes that's emerging from today. You're taking it out of its context in order to use it for a political purpose. And so in terms of the actual question you asked, I think that's how history usually makes its way into the political debate. As far as over the long term, that's maybe a more interesting and nicer or a story that has more potential, and that is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves can shape our identity as individuals and as this collective ideological nation state, and thus it could be a force for good. The more honest it is. I would like this example that Calvin Coolidge gave of patriotism, where he sort of says that because we believe that the relations between human beings were correctly identified by the founders, and that that these founding ideals are true, anyone who's telling the truth in context is actually performing an act of patriotism. So you should never be afraid of learning the truth about your country, because every act of truth telling is an act of patriotism. So I just mean that in a kind of the long-term sense. In the short-term sense, history is taken out of context and used as a weapon. Over the long term, if we really believe that human beings should be free, we shouldn't be afraid of telling the truth about the past.
Amen. Jeffrey, your thoughts?
Herbert, what HBCU did you get your degree from?
Herbert?
Is muted.
Is he got to be unmuted?
Alabama State.
Alabama State.
Alabama.
Okay, go
Yeah,
Alabama.
sorry about that. Yeah, Alabama State University, sir.
Okay, and sorry, I was a bit, your question confused me. Could you say it again, please?
Well, essentially, I was asking both of you, as historians that have had to explain the relationship, between history and historical events and how they've impacted social and cultural policy as, they develop along, that framework. Like, for example, trying to explain to somebody how a state law or a policy has been impacted by a historical perspective, or how we perceive certain political or cultural affiliations or stereotypes has been impacted by historical perspective. How hard has it been for you guys as historians to explain those types of concepts to students and to non-students? Because I know a lot of African Americans, when we try to explain how those sorts of perspectives impact, how policies play out and who they affect, we tend to have those discussions a lot with people.
Okay, thanks, Herbert. I think I've got the hang of it now. Just let me say very briefly, just two things. I mean, the first thing to recognize is the United States is essentially a very conservative nation. And so therefore, change has been gradual in all sorts of ways. And it's a big problem. I think that some people on this panel would disagree with me or disagree with that definition, but it's a very conservative nation. And I'm struck by the irony that apparently universities are full of these Marxist radicals. And as I say to myself, as a self-confessed card-carrying member of every radical organization imaginable, I've had a hellish time for nearly 40 years. I wish and I want to share that with my Republican colleagues, because these places are not sort of hornet's nests of radicals. I wish they bloody well were, but they're not. It's a conservative place, and even the liberal bastions are not that radical at all. So that is one of the challenges, I think, Herbert, that broader context and milieu. The second is, I think, as Stephen, I hate to agree with Stephen, but I have to agree with Stephen here. And that is that, yeah, I think sociologists, psychologists, political scientists, policy makers, etc., will choose history in a very sort of utilitarian way to support their arguments or their agendas, and that's sort of understandable, but it's really problematic, and that can go both ways. It can support something which is progressive, and it can support something reactionary. The third thing, in terms of sort of teachability and audiences, I think the critical distinction is between an academic audience, professors, students, etc., where you talk one particular way, and then a public audience where you sort of talk another way, right? I think that one of the most important things, and what would really help the bridge, I think, I'm going to be sort of arrogant enough here to suggest to the organizers of the Bridge Project, I think one of the great ways to reach people is to actually have those people, right, ask beforehand what they actually want to talk about. Because in my experience, unlike the university where you're lecturing to undergraduates, or you're, leading a graduate seminar for PhD students, or you're talking to colleagues because you've got a paper, when you come to talking to the public, the first thing to do is to learn the lesson of the activist, which is you start where the audience is. And I know where some of the audience members are here because I've got the questions, and Stefan and John, etc. But a lot of other people, we're sort of shooting in the dark here. We don't know. And that will be really useful, because then we could say, okay, let's engage this. So why are you saying this? And go from there. I find will be very, very useful. So Herbert, that would be the third thing. I think it depends largely on the audience, how you sort of, how you respond.
So we go ahead, Herbert. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, first, I thank you guys for, really, diving into that question. It was something that was kind of on my brain while you guys were discussing the lost cause history and everything else. And again, I won't be long. I just thank you guys for having this debate. It was really stimulating.
Excellent. So I know we're running over time and I don't want to keep our esteemed panelists too long. So I just want, I guess, each of you to give some parting thoughts and advice to the Bridge Project members and its leadership team. I think, Jeffrey, you started giving us some advice, but just in terms of how we should move forward and building bridges among diverse communities through the lens of race and racism, equity, and equality. Stephen, do you want to go ahead and start?
I don't know that I have any summarizing thoughts other than thank you for inviting me. I've never met Jeffrey before, so it's nice to meet a colleague on the other side of the country, and thank him for the discussion. I didn't know if we were going to disagree. I didn't find that much to disagree with you about. So I guess I had hoped for a little more friction, but I found you delightful. So it was nice to meet you. But that's the only concluding thought I have.
Okay, Jeffrey.
So I think that a couple of things about the Bridge Project. I mean, I'd never heard of you. I'm sure there must be lots of these types of bridge projects, right? That's great. It reminds me of the American obsession with organizing and getting together. And that was first pointed out by Marcus Garvey, who was this, a very well-known a radical internationalist in the 1920s. The American propensity for organizing, for getting together, it's pretty impressive. I think that's great. I think these types of things are representative of civil society as opposed to the state, where ordinary citizens, right, come together to discuss important matters. I appreciate the Bridge Project occurred 2 months before the killing of George Floyd, but the connections are there, the milieu is there, the zeitgeist is there, right? The spirit of the times is there. So that's important. But what's more important than the origins is where you go next, right? And that's got a lot to do, I think, with, well, it's building a group. On the other hand, you've got the perfect tool, and COVID gave it to you, right? Which is technology. I mean, let's be honest here. I mean, this is just transforming the very way we communicate. And this, it seems to me, is very important as this being what you're doing is a very important way of communicating carefully, encouraging reasoned dissent. I mean, I can be a dissenting, someone's fill in the blanks, right, Stephen? But I recognize a platform for when reasoned dissent is encouraged and can get you somewhere, right? And I think that's very, very important. There's also a time for unreasonable dissent, really, and that maybe that should be a topic for another time, because I'm always a bit skeptical about what I think is polite conversations. Sometimes conversations need to be impolite because the nature of the subject is brutal. How on earth you can be polite about protesting slavery, I do not know. And yet that's a criticism. But anyway, so I think the tool is there for expanding the group. I think, encouraging some type of sort of, it's great to talk. And I know Stephen shares this with me, which is always a captive audience. This is wonderful, but it needs to be more of a dialogic between the speakers and audience members. Mm-hmm. And they shouldn't feel intimidated just because Stephen and I have the qualifications. I think, or whomever the speakers are, I think it should be contributionist. I mean, I'm always trying to push against, or you have to it's a difficult it's a difficult road to hoe, but it's this on the one hand, you've clearly got more knowledge than anyone else in the room, right?
Mhm.
On the other hand, you don't want to discourage people from talking to you precisely because of that expertise, right?
Absolutely.
And that's difficult. And you don't, it's easier in the university, right, Stephen? Because you've got that students, they're paying for a degree, boom, and you're the professor and you get paid to teach them. Okay, boom. He gets paid a lot more than I, of course, because I'm at Howard University. But I think with these types of sort of discussions, yeah, I think it should be open-ended. And I think it will almost be trying to replicate a sort of a large hall where people talk, right? And people argue and debate. I mean, and you're gonna, the eggheads aren't gonna participate because they're too busy doing other things. So you don't have to worry too much. Anyway, I just thought that, I hope that's useful. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much for the invite, and I really wish you well. It's not a lost cause, it's a noble cause.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both, Professor Stephen Tootle and Professor Jeffrey Kerr-Ritchie, for joining us today. And thank you both for saying yes and sharing some of your knowledge and experience with us. So with that, we'll close. Thank you very much. And if people want to stay and chat for a few minutes or available, we'll be online for about 5 or 10 minutes. Thank you so much.